Have you not heard of the Forest Brothers, the partisans who decided the shades of the Baltic forests to the moment of capitulation? Their story is about heroism, survival, and resistance, which was unfolded in the canopy of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Today, go out to those woods and into the lives of average human beings who made a stand in the most remarkable way against both Soviet and Nazi oppression and fought against their freedom at some of the darkest moments of the 20th century. The tale of bravery takes place during the messiness of the World War II, a period during which the Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were trapped in the crossfire between two implacable superpowers. Their destiny was determined with the help of a secret diplomatic agreement called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1940, a cynical agreement between the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, in which Eastern Europe was divided into spheres of influence. Their history of independence had been removed off the paper long before they could even see a single soldier come through their borders. They had no option of their own, and they were forced to watch as the map of Europe was redrawn without their participation or even their awareness. A little less than a year later, the tide of war changed once again. In 1941, the Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union and kicked out the Red Army of the Baltic nation and took its own oppressive government there. The transformation did not introduce actual liberation, but just a new flag over the same misery, since the German occupation introduced persecution, compulsory service, and the atrocities of war to all towns and villages. Nor by 1944 had the lines changed fronts. The Red Army came back and, storming to the west, reoccupied the cities it had lost, this time hoisting its banners as though they were liberators who had come to free the territory. To lots of buy when Soviet troops entered the three countries and took control over them, they had no idea thoughts. Soviet return was not a liberation, but a new wave of fear, the same machine of arrest, deportation, repression which had plagued them previously, now fortified by victory. What was brought forward as redemption was rather the drawing up of a long, sadistic circle. At that initial Soviet occupation, whole families already had the experience of the harsh purges, enforced deportations, and the constant fear of losing their national identity. Life was full of uncertainties every day. As neighbor been kidnapped in the night, customs were stifled, and adherence to one's own culture was regarded as a criminal activity. That is why when the Red Army came back to the Baltic states in 1944, the memory of this initial occupation was still fresh. The thousands of men and women chose not to give in to the same regime ever again. They did not give in to oppression. Instead, they disappeared in the wilderness, opting to resist rather than resigning. These strong-willed people will soon become the Forest Brothers. The name had a literal and symbolic sense. Their fortress and their refuge were the forests of Estonia, of Latvia, and of Lithuania, and their hiding place was a huge maze of pine and birch, which had hidden their bodies and was now hiding their flaming spirit to stay free. They established bunkhouses, created nets, and made ambushes against Soviet soldiers in those shaded, whispering woods. A few of them had been soldiers in previous wars, but most of them were just ordinary citizens who had left their professions, leaving fields, their books, their classes, and their priests to take the place of chalk with a rifle and their robes with battered army coats. It was stronger than any arms they had in common, namely a strong feeling of patriotism towards their country, and a feeling that annexation by foreign rule should not be the last page in the history of their country. The Forest Brothers did not venture into their battle with the illusion of winning the battle against the Soviet Union in a traditional warfare. They keenly knew that no group of rebels, even the most committed ones, could challenge on equal footing with tanks, guns, and well-organized divisions of a superpower. Their real aim was in some other direction, to reduce the Soviet occupation to costs that were intolerable, and to create a lasting reminder to Moscow that these Baltic territories could never be completely brought down as long as the forests continued to rise against their oppressors. By perseverance and sacrifice, they were made the dying note of national independence, a breathing image of that will to be free that still smoldered low even in degradation. This covert army consisted of about 50,000 men and women in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania at their height. They were scattered over large areas of wild country, through the deep woods and the marshlands to the remote hamlets where the villagers who believed in the cause took everything upon themselves to keep it alive. They were well grounded in guerrilla warfare, which was a war of ambush, sabotage, and lightning strikes, and depended on speed, terrain, and morale. They attacked Soviet patrols at random, smashed NKVD convoys, attacked communication lines, and attacked communist strongholds, then disappeared again into the protecting forest. There were a few skirmishes that grew into hours of fierce battle that tried of courage and perseverance until the partisans fled during the darkness. But in addition to these confrontations, there was also the daily experience of life in the wild, which presented its share of a fight. Forest brothers were living in underground bunkhouses dug deep into the earth, always on the run to avoid being caught. They had to rely on the local leaders of the day to supply them with food, medicine, and crucial information, creating an invisible web of solidarity that bound together remote communities. The merciless toll of winters in the Baltics was even more fatal than gunfire by the enemy. Frosty nights, sickness, starvation killed more people than gunshots. Nevertheless, their rebellion never subsided with the sufferings and the denial. The woods were still alive with the murmurs of a liberty which was not yet to be yielded. The Forest Brothers were not perceived as a romantic patriot or heroic fighters of the freedom of their country. Rather, to the Soviet state, they were a threat to be destabilized at all costs. The Soviet government perceived their opposition as an issue on internal survival and defense, and not political dissent. Special units of the NKVD were put in place, specially trained and equipped to hunt these guerrilla fighters down deep into the thick woods. What had started out as a movement to restore order quickly turned into a dark and very personal struggle where villages, marshlands, forests were the battlefields where the demarcation between soldier and civilian became unclear. The Soviets also used the method of collective punishment against whole villages that were suspected to be helping the partisans. The communities suffered losses as their homes were burnt, their families were separated, and thousands of civilians were declared the enemy of the people. Deportation of the Baltic states. During the 1940s and early 1950s, the population of the Baltic states was deported to the Siberian labor camps to the extent of over 200,000. Most never returned, and their names were not documented again. Soviet oppression was not based entirely on the brute force, and thus deception turned out to be an equally powerful tool in their arsenal. Soviet soldiers would also masquerade as partisans to enter the villages cooperating with them, revealing hidden webs of foodstuff providers and couriers. Those villagers who were fooled into giving out the hideout or stockpile locations were immediately arrested, tortured, or executed. Fear or reward motivated informers who spread everywhere in cities and country and caused a net of mistrust that disintegrated community values. Even a knock on the door could be an indication of arrest or denunciation. Even normal movement was dangerous in such an air of fear and uncertainty. Other resistance fighters were male fighters that disguised themselves as women by using the fact that women were not recruited into the Red Army so as to avoid Soviet guard and move between the safe houses without being detected. This period had made everyday life an eternal survival operation, shrouded in secret, deception, and a permanent fight against a total omniscient government. Towards the end of the 1940s, the Soviet security machine became so large and powerful that it literally strangled the Baltic countries with its long fingers. Checkpoints were placed on all roads, raids were carried out in the middle of the night, and sweeps of surveillance were launched into the woods where freedom fighters were hiding. Existence to those who still resisted turned out to be a trial of fortune and fate. The smoke of a single campfire might attract patrols, and one indiscreet engagement might destroy a whole partisan cell. In Lithuania, leaders like Adolphus Ramanauskas, who was referred to as the Hawk by his fellow resistance men, managed to preserve the thread of resistance until the first years of the 1950s. He and his other leaders went on forming partisan groups, sending messages, and keeping the morale up amongst the other isolated groups in the wilderness. However, one after another, as decades followed, such commanders were monitored, arrested, and muted with the help of prison, torture, or execution. Their names in the Soviet official version are lost, erased by the history, as though they had never organized one of the blazing underground conflicts in Europe. In nearby Estonia, the struggle lasted even longer and hung on deep into the woods and the marshlands long after any formal opposition in other countries had dropped into silence. One of the last representatives of the Forest Brothers who refused to give in was August Sabbe. He's been in the remote countryside shelters and has been moving about different secret bunkhouses over the decades and survived on his instinct and his determination. Sabbe was a very elderly man, dying just steps ahead of being caught by the Soviet agents who eventually found him in 1978. One day in the fall, as he was by the side of the banks of the Vohandu River, two KGB men dressed as fishermen came to him. A slight struggle erupted when they attempted to arrest him, and Sabbe fell in the water. It is not clear whether his death was an accident or he was pushed underwater, but the message behind his last act was clear. He would prefer to die in that shallow river than be a prisoner of a losing cause. Why continue doing that when the chances were completely against them? When with each successive year, anew arrests, a diminishing store of supplies, and a decreasing number of safe houses that could hide them? To the Forest Brothers, it never was just about survival. It was concerning something much more important: the preservation of an idea, the belief that freedom is worth all sacrifices. As the woods became more silent and their ranks were reduced, these partisans knew that their fight was more than the present moment. A good number of them had come to accept the fact that they might never in their lives see their homelands, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, stand free once more. But they were convinced that their rebellion in itself was not in vain, that to struggle against the odds which were overwhelming was to make sure that the very ideal of independence would not pass away with them. Their struggle was no longer a military struggle. It was now a living symbol, a vow spoken down the generations that their countries were not dead, just silenced. Deep in the woods, in the chilly winters, in the disguised marches, the Forest Brothers clung to that promise, leaving behind them tales, symbols, and songs to keep the thought of freedom alive when they were not to speak out about it. The recollection of these forest fighters resurfaced with new strength decades later, when the previously impenetrable foundation of the Soviet Union started to crumble and fall in the year 1991. Their history made a new generation who, growing up on the stories about the silent opposition and unboughten pride, felt themselves as the heirs of that incomplete struggle. This bravery formed a moral basis to the many independence movements that had been witnessed in the Baltics, as a reminder that freedom once struggled against could never be truly killed. The legacy of the Forest Brothers remains very strong in the Baltic states today that live on in various forms, as monuments, memorial stones, rich archives, books, and highly eloquent documentaries. They are the part and parcel of the life and national conscience, and the names of streets, schools, and military units proudly display their names. The tight timber-lined tunnels, which the Forest Brothers used to hide in, are hard to reach, and the visitors have rare chances to see them inside museums and well-preserved bunkers. It is these musing experiences that bring into reality a visceral perception of their sheer boldness, the great danger that they took in putting their lives on shaky ground in the slender arc of land under the shelter of the trees, the roots of ancient trees. The tale of the Forest Brothers rings long after the events occurred in the past as an effective reminder of the enormous price that was sometimes paid in the pursuit of freedom. In the world where the war has not ended yet, and especially in the light of the current war in Ukraine and the nature of the new European security, the citizens of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania will see strong echoes of their own history. They understand deeply that sovereignty and independence defense does not only exist at the level of political abstraction. The fight of Forest Brothers shows that it is not only about the territorial borders, but is aimed to the very basis of the collective memory, language, and the right to choose your own way of living. Their narration cautions that liberty is delicate and should be nurtured with pure determination to maintain the identity and the future of a nation. The story of the Forest Brothers demonstrates the strength of ordinary people who will not agree with the fact that fear is the last word. Although the dark days may have been very dark, the struggle against slavery continues, generation after generation, like some silent burning flame not noticeable by the wind. With the challenges the world is going through, it is only a reminder through their story that being free is not something you earn once and stay, but something you must defend, challenge, and believe in one more time and again. And when this trip to the woods of the Baltics had touched you, you might sign up, forward this video to a historical lover, and leave a comment on what you found the most surprising after reading the stories of the Forest Brothers.